Welcome to this video on addiction. My name is Sally Openshaw and I am a specialist addiction counsellor working with sexual addiction. But as part of that, I learned to work with other addictions as well. And I'm here with my colleague Lisa.
Hello, I'm a counsellor and I work at the Somerset Counselling Centre in Taunton. I trained as an integrative counsellor and I work quite creatively within that field. My background is in art and design and I've been working at the centre now for approximately 2 years.
So let's start with a plan of what we're going to do. So the slide will show you what we plan to cover today. What we're going to start off with is defining what addiction is and the causes behind addiction. We will then consider what it looks like for the addict. Then we will think about the impact on the people around, the impact for the addict and also the people around, so that you can consider how do you support someone who's going through an addictive process. So this next slide shows you the definition of addiction. This term addiction is a really overused word and it's often used, people in casual conversation talk about I'm addicted to this, that or the other, I'm addicted to box sets or I'm addicted to running. What's important with the technical definition of addiction is that you have a dependency on that substance or the behaviour that goes with it. And more importantly than that is that there is a process of habituation. And that's the technical term to describe how something that previously worked doesn't become enough. So usually you have to escalate in wanting more for it to give you the same hit as it did previously. And then the last point about the addiction process, which is the most painful bit, is that there comes a point with addiction when the addiction is the relationship you seek. And so the person can't stop even if they know that it's destroying their family, destroying their work, destroying all sorts of things around them. They get to a point where the addiction is the main focus. So as we start thinking about addiction, we thought it might be useful for you to just think in your own minds of all the sorts of things people could get addicted to. And so just jot down on a piece of paper anything that comes to mind that you think may be addictive. So whilst you're doing that, Lisa and I had a chat about that earlier and we came up with some ideas. It may not be an exhaustive list, but let's hear some of the ideas that we said earlier, Lisa.
Well, the most obvious one that springs to my mind to start with is probably alcohol. And the reason I think of that first is because it's a kind of everyday, it's around, it's at births, it's at deaths, it's sort of ceremonial and it's in the home. So I think of alcohol, I think of sugar addiction, food, sex, pornography, drugs, gambling. The list goes on, Sally.
So certainly I would add in shopping, tobacco, cannabis, any of the drugs that you might have access to. So yeah, that's our starter for 10, but you may have ideas of your own that we haven't even thought to include in our list. So if we move to the next slide about the causes of addiction, we've provided a slide of a stool which has got 3 main legs. And if we're working with addiction, quite often we might look to hunt the cause as psychotherapists. And it may not change the way we treat somebody, but it certainly helps with understanding to look behind the behaviour to see where it came from. So the first leg of that stool would be trauma. And any traumatic experience can lead to an addictive process commencing afterwards. And that's often because we're trying to numb ourselves from the overwhelming sensations associated with a trauma memory. So by dulling our mind with alcohol, or by disassociating and excusing ourselves into looking at something online that might distract us. Those are techniques that we might be using to try and help ourselves with an underlying traumatic memory. The second area is opportunity. Sometimes people get caught in addiction just because they get exposed to it. And once they're exposed, it in itself can perpetuate through that exposure. So someone might offer you a joint and you enjoy it, and it's just chance. There was nothing going wrong before that made you do it. But once you get the taste, it may in itself drive you into continuing wanting more. The third area, which is probably the areas that psychotherapists spend a lot of time looking at, is what happens in early childhood development. And the reason why we look there for causes is because some of our early attachment to objects are affected by our attachment with real people back in time. And so if I don't have a very solid or secure attachment when I first come forward into the world, I might learn from a very early age to attach to an object. And although I wouldn't start drinking at a very small age, I might attach to soothing myself by relying on object support. The other thing that's important, that's really interesting to learn about, is that we learn impulse control at a certain age. Probably around the age of 6, we get taught it by our parents that make us wait for things. Now, if a child is never taught impulse control, then it will be very hard for them to manage addiction because they won't know when to stop. And if they want something, they help themselves to it rather than having any techniques or resources within them to slow down that suck into the addictive process. If you're interested in that, I really recommend you watch something online called the marshmallow test. And this is a test where they give children the option to eat a marshmallow, but if they wait, they can have 2. And it shows you all the techniques that children use to try and wait. And the techniques that help them wait are the techniques about them not imagining what it tastes like, so not getting over involved in the sweetness, not smelling it so that they don't begin to fire up their interest in it, and thinking it as an object that's over there, so they stand themselves back from it. So just have a look online, and that will give you something to help understand when we learn about impulse and how that might help in addiction. So the next slide takes us to a somewhat complicated picture of the addiction cycle. And I'm going to just try and make it simple so that what you understand is the addiction pattern typically follows a cycle that goes round. And that cycle in itself reinforces the second addictive behavior. So let me start with thinking about somebody who's just acted out their addiction. So what happens usually afterwards is quite often there's regret. That regret can happen very quickly, or it can happen 24 hours later, or it can happen when they walk into their house and see their loved ones. But that regret usually causes shame, pain, and guilt. And the person can say very negative things to themselves at that point. They basically, after that, will often reconstitute themselves. And what that means is they'll make promises to themselves. They'll say, I'm never going to do that again. I'm going to walk away from this, or I'm not going to get myself involved. And then nothing happens for a while. And then suddenly they may be triggered by something that makes them feel not good about themselves. They may feel unloved, they may feel over emotional, they may get thoughts about themselves that are going to be critical. What then happens is they go into preparation phase for the acting out. And this is imagining how nice it might be if they could just blank out from the awfulness of those triggers. This phase may be very short or it may be long. People may spend days planning how they can get access to the thing that they want. Often they zone out at this phase and they can be completely absorbed by their plans and getting engaged in that. So it occupies time in their head, and then from their head, they will then go into acting out, which is a behavioral response. And that will be getting engaged in whatever the activity is that they're involved in. This cycle can be really rapid, or they can spend ages in one stage, resting, before they move into the next phase. And sometimes they can go backwards into regret, and that might keep them resolving their promise not to urge and not to follow the urge. But other times they can just quickly whip round again and they're on again in the cycle. So to remember that addiction usually follows a pattern, and that pattern is referred to as an addictive cycle. And the fact that there is a cycle means that there are options to break that cycle at various points. And that's what we as therapists would do, is to target breakpoints within the cycle. So over to you, Lisa, to actually talk about the next thing.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the impact on self. And as you were talking, Sally, I was thinking about the hierarchy of the addiction and where addicts often place it. So it's often placed right at the top, right above food. You know, we're all in some way addicted to food because we need it, it's a necessity. But actually, an addict might place, for example, alcohol right above that. So, so when I'm thinking about the self and the road that one might go down, the road to addiction, there'll be lots of things going on for that client. So, as part of that kind of heightened hierarchy, we might have a relationship breakdown. We might have a sense of loneliness, the inability to reach out to others, that real sort of focus on the object of desire, almost, that everything else sort of pales into insignificance. Placing self quite often in dangerous situations that then result in further complications along the way. And that road also brings about a decreased socialization, so that you limit who you're speaking to, who you're talking to, who you're engaging with, because the only focus is really the addiction, because that's right at the top of that hierarchy of needs almost. And also the inability, I think, to stay away from that, which is what you were just talking about, Sally, in terms of that cycle. You're right, as psychotherapists, we try and break that cycle, find ways into it, to deviate it, divert it. But it's that strong inability to stay away that a lot of addicts find that when they're on that road, it's hard to pull away from. And as a result of that, some of the commitments that they might usually or normally do become abandoned, because the only road that they see is the one to addiction, the road that they're on at the moment. And with that brings about a lack of control, which then feeds into, I think, the next slide, Sally, which is the impact on others and the effects of that self and that object of addiction on others and how that impacts.
Thank you. So the most important thing we want to emphasize here is it has a relational impact. If you're living with somebody or you're friends with somebody who has suddenly put something else as priority, then suddenly you don't have the same importance. So lots of people talk about feeling lonely when they're alongside someone who's addicted, because they have been abandoned. It's true that a priority greater than them has become the person's priority. Not only that, it might really upset you to watch what's happening to them. The person who you loved and cared for has suddenly become someone different, who isn't as reliable, isn't as responsible as they were before. So you're dealing with your own relationship loss. You've lost the dad you knew, you've lost your mate who was there for you. You are less central now in that person's life. And so, even if you might want to help, you might have to experience your own powerlessness, that despite all your great offerings or your great attempts to try and make someone change, they may not be changing. You can also experience the broken promises. They said they were going to be there to meet you, but actually, a greater, better opportunity came up to access their addictive cycle. And so you get let down, you lose trust, and you basically find that lies are around you. And that can damage your own self esteem and your own self worth. Because if you repeatedly ask someone if they're telling you the truth and they tell you that they are, but your gut feeling tells you that they're not telling you the truth and that there is some lying going on, then you can begin to feel anxious about whether you can trust yourself anymore, whether your judgment is accurate or whether the story they're telling you is accurate. And when people discover addiction and a partner may really confirm it, there's sometimes some great relief in the individual who thought they were going crazy because their intuition told them something was seriously wrong, but the other person denied it and denied it and lied. So people's sense of self can be diminished. Their sense of relationship with the person with the addiction is certainly changing. And occasionally we can feel really shameful in that place because we think it might reflect badly on us if our partner may be in an addictive process, or we might take on too much responsibility and fail to make a change. And so it's not unusual for people to be very muddled when living alongside someone with addiction. So we bring you to a visual slide that Lisa has drawn up for us. So I'm going to hand you back to Lisa to just talk through this slide.
Okay. So you'll see a slide with two interlinking circles, and on the left-hand side, it's the addict self. So with that, you have their behaviour, the actions and triggers, what's going on for them. And on the right-hand side, you have the other. So that might be the significant other, that might be a partnership, wife, husband. And as Sally was just saying, all of those kind of feelings that the other is experiencing. So loss of trust, the lies and the anxiety, the diminished sense of the self for the other as well. So what this diagram really shows is the impact of addiction on the self, on the addict, but also the other, and how integrated they become. And some of those feelings then sort of get transferred over. So it ends up that both are experiencing very similar feelings. So a sense of powerlessness in one side, shame, feeling less important. We're talking about hierarchy, where is the other on the sort of hierarchy of importance? Probably quite low down, where alcohol is very high up, or whatever the addiction might be. So this really demonstrates how it's very difficult to sort of almost pull apart from that kind of relationship with the addicted self. But it's possible to pull away, to find autonomy, not to be sort of integrated within that. And I think Sally will lead on from that point.
Okay, so one of the things we want to offer is there are a lot of resources available depending on the nature of the addiction. And so if you Google the title of the addiction, you will get up support resources for that specific addiction. A lot of the addiction models that you will see out there in the support groups that run on an abstinence model. And so that is about someone learning not to do it. And gradually they will be supported in going through a collection of steps towards abstinence. And certainly Alcoholics Anonymous, some of the Sex Addiction Anonymous or Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous, all of the anonymous groups tend to work as self-help support groups where people who've been through the process then offer support to people going through the process. In those groups, you'll typically attend, listen to people's stories. You will get a sponsor who will be your go-to person to help you if you need support when you get urges. So alongside that, there's a lot of recovery programs that are available for people with addictions. And those recovery programs are much more focused around understanding urges. So their focus is much more about how to manage and break the urge response that you get. So to learn more impulse control, learn some behavioral changes that might help you when you feel desperate to go to your go-to object. There's also another type of treatment that would be used in some addiction programs, which would be a detox program, where you have whatever the substance is removed from your body using a hospitalization process, and then that would be followed by recovery support. So online, you will find various groups you can attend. There are groups for partners and family members. And so there is some diversity of getting some shared support from others who are going through the same as yourself. I think as therapists, we would tend to attack the whole cycle. So if you were struggling yourself with an addiction and wanted therapy as a support, then we would, as I said, would help you find break points going around the cycle. So if you're recommending therapy for a loved one or a colleague, then that's mostly what they will get from most of the therapy services available. So we want to end this video with a really important message to you, which is the 3 C's of addiction. So the first C is you can't control it. You can't control somebody else's addiction. You can't cure it, even if you want to, because only they can take the responsibility for managing the addictive process. Even if you try policing them, you can't cure it. And then you can't control it. And the last thing is that you are very unlikely to have caused it, even if you are blamed. For the reasons that I explained earlier, the cause is probably rooted in a different psychological process. And so as we leave, just hold those 3 C's in your mind. You can't control it, you can't cure it, and you're very unlikely to have caused it. So, is there anything you wanted to add as we close, Lisa?
Well, I just wanted to end with the same sentiment as we did for the Self-Harm module, where we talked about that things can be shared and they can be understood, and that living with someone that has an addiction, it can be understood by others.
And so, as we leave you on this seminar, there is hope out there, and there are people who are willing to be alongside you. So this does not have to be a lonely experience. So thank you very much for listening to us, and we hope that it will be helpful.